Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the APCG online colloquium. We're very excited to have Safia Farole's paper today with Danielle Resnick from IFPRI joining us to discuss the paper, and hopefully we'll also get Jonathan Morse from UConn looped in pretty soon. Safia has a few minutes of a presentation to get us started, so maybe we could start there and actually, maybe we could just go around and just introduce ourselves with our names and our home-based institutions. So I'm Naomi Chino at Michigan, and I'm one of the organizers of the Colloquium.
I am Safia Farole, and I'm a grad student at UCLA.
I'm Shelby.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm Shelby Grossman. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Memphis.
I'm Danielle Resnick. I'm a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C.
I'm Alex Deisenhouse. I'm a PhD student at Cornell. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, good to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
Okay, great. So we still don't have Jonathan, but maybe we'll just get started with Safia.
That sounds good. Would you like me to start the screen sharing?
Yes, please.
Can everybody see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you for joining me today. Thank you for reading my paper. And I will go ahead and just begin with a brief overview of my paper, just to kind of jog your memory. The title of it is Voters, Party Credibility, and Opposition Support in South Africa. And I'll just begin by talking about sort of what motivated me to write this paper. This paper is a chapter from my dissertation that broadly examines what are the sources of support for opposition parties within a dominant party system. And this type of party system is one in which a single party repeatedly, but usually through democratic means or democratic window dressing, wins elections for substantial periods of time. And there are a couple of variations of party dominance. They fall along two ends of a spectrum. Typically, there are the more democratic types, and then there are the more autocratic type. And you might be familiar with some of the famous examples of party dominance in the political science literature, such as Mexico's PRI and Japan's LDP party. In my studies, I focus mainly on the ones that have what could generally be considered democratic institutions, such as free press. The opposition is generally allowed to exist without too much repression. Not too many cases fit that within the African context, but in my studies, I focus on South Africa. And in particular, I examined the Democratic Alliance Party, which is the largest opposition party in South Africa. And in this chapter in particular, I'm examining voters within a dominant party framework. The specific question that I'm dealing with is how do partisans of the ruling party come to support the opposition? Do opposition parties have a reputation for good governance in the eyes of the ruling party supporters? And if so, how does this impact future vote intentions? And briefly, my argument focuses on the issue of credibility. And one of the reasons that voters in this type of party system typically do not support the opposition is because they don't see them as being competent or credible when it comes to governance. And I argue that local politics and the actions that opposition parties make or take in local government help them gain credibility. And just to define what a credible reputation is, a party has a credible reputation if voters perceive it as trustworthy and competent, and if they are convinced that the party represents, protects, and advances their material interests. And in my dissertation in general, I focus on the role of basic service delivery in local government and factors such as local candidate nominations as things that explain how opposition parties grow in this context. Within the case of South Africa, the identity plays a very important role. The racial characteristics of candidates matters to voters, and voters make racial associations between parties about parties. So for instance, the Democratic Alliance is typically considered or branded by the ANC as a quote-unquote white party, given its given its background, and also the fact that most of its base consists of white voters. And there has been several empirical studies showing that many black voters in the country do see the DA as being racially exclusive. And one of the ways that the party tries to change this image is by recruiting black candidates and putting them in prominent positions. So one example would be the nomination of Mamuse Maimane as the DA's head in 2015. This was the first time that the party elected a black leader, and so this is I view this as an alternative explanation, or I test this as an alternative explanation to explain why do black ANC supporters support the DA. Does race play an issue? Does it matter when the DA is led by a white candidate versus when it's led by a black candidate? And so the design of my study is, the case selection for my study focuses on two cities, Johannesburg and Nelson Mandela Bay. When studying opposition parties, cities play an important role, as opposition parties typically tend to do better in urban areas. And I selected both of these two cities because they are cities where the DA has made substantial gains in terms of earning seats in the local council. As a matter of fact, up until recently, the party held the majority of seats in Nelson Mandela Bay. And in Johannesburg, it's the second largest party. And so I wanted to pick two cities where this phenomenon actually does exist, where the opposition does have a presence. And in addition to that, the DA was in a position to nominate mayors after the 2016 local government election in both of these cities and also in another city, Pretoria. I wanted to select two cities that not only fell within the criteria I'm examining, but also cities in which the party nominated a white candidate and one where it nominated a black candidate as mayor. And for my study, I ran a survey, mobile phone survey in both of these two cities. Overall, the sample size is 700. I attempted to get an even number of respondents in both cities. However, as you read in the paper, there was a political shakeup in Nelson Mandela Bay. The mayor was ousted, and the survey was in the field at the time. So I decided to stop collecting surveys as soon as that happened. And so I'm just briefly going over the findings. I find in my survey that party credibility is a significant determinant of opposition support among ANC partisans. Those who view the DA as having the best reputation at fighting corruption, which is the way that I operationalized my independent variable, are more likely to express an intention to vote for the party in the future. In the two cities that I selected, the candidate traits matter much less. However, when I tested this argument in a more representative sample of respondents, nationwide sample, I find that that it does matter, that the leadership attitudes about the DA leadership are predictive of future vote intentions, and in particular support for the Mamuse Maimane. And so I used that as a way to kind of see how generalizable my finding was, the negative finding, and we can talk more about why there might be discrepancies there. But in general, just to conclude, some of the implications of my finding are that partisanship is fluid in South Africa. This may not necessarily be surprising. However, I found in my survey that many partisans of the ANC consider other parties more credible than their own. And again, given the fact that there have been so many corruption allegations that the ANC has has experienced, it's not surprising that many feel that way. And so, and as well for the with regard to the EFF, many ANC partisans actually view the EFF as the most credible party. And again, this is an interesting finding, maybe not so surprising. But what does surprise me is the fact that the EFF is a very young party. It has only been in existence for 4 years, and it doesn't have much experience running local government. However, this most likely has a lot to do with the role of rhetoric and populist rhetoric that the EFF leadership uses to sort of mobilize voters. And so, again, we can also talk much more about why I'm finding this a result as well. And that's as far as I wanted to go over, and I'll open it up for you guys.
Okay, thanks so much. With our two discussants, hi, Anatan, I'm so glad you could join us. I'm not sure who would like to go first. It's totally up to you. Of our two discussants.
I'm also
like
agnostic.
Okay.
Okay, I guess it's easier if I go first.
Okay.
So I really appreciate you inviting me to comment on the paper, and also this is a really kind of novel, method of engaging with the colloquium. So I kind of applaud you for Naomi for organizing this as well. And I really enjoy this paper because, first, Safia, you're tackling a really important issue on, how do opposition parties kind of get a foothold and actually combat against dominant party regimes. And I do think this is really important in our kind of non-authoritarian democratic countries in Africa, thinking of Botswana, thinking of Namibia, why opposition parties have struggled so much. It's a really important question there. And I think also the fact that you are looking at cities, and we don't see many people actually using kind of cities as a unit of analysis in African politics. I think those are really important contributions. And so I'll just give some comments. I have them written up that I'll share with you afterwards as well. But so just, particularly on issues related to conceptualization, theory, and empirical basis. And so the first thing that kind of struck me was these key concepts that are central to your hypotheses. This concept of party credibility and then also ethnic queuing. And so how you're measuring these, how you're operationalizing these seems a bit different than what we would think, given what the concept means. So for party credibility, you kind of say at the outset that parties can use their tenure in local government to demonstrate competence at governing by delivering services effectively and managing local government well. But your metric for operationalization is respondents' perception of which party is the best at fighting corruption. And so, we may think fighting corruption and delivering services are strongly correlated, but they are conceptually distinct. And they're also conceptually different from another concept you use a lot, which is good governance. So you kind of use these three a bit interchangeably, but I don't think they're fully equivalent. And so in this regard, I think discussing more a little bit about the DA's credibility and actually delivering services in the two cities that you look at would be useful, as well as whether you have any data from GeoPol about the services that your respondents have access to. That could also kind of bolster that particular element of credibility, that it's not really about just corruption, it's about actually delivering something, because that's central to your argument, that you've been in government so you can show that you've delivered something. And of course, as you just mentioned, your surveys affect a little bit by the timing that for the past 2 years or so, we've seen so much on state of capture and corruption within the ANC. And as you said, it's not too surprising people see the ANC as not being, even ANC partisans see the ANC as not being, the party that's about fighting corruption. But this may not necessarily support your argument that they are instead supporting the DA because of its strong record. So in other words, the outcome may look the same. ANC partisans are supporting the DA or the EFF, but the motivation could be different. So it could be that they're actually, partisans are kind of punishing the ANC because of its misdeeds or abandoning it from its misdeeds instead of supporting the DA because of its performance. And I think in both cases, a little bit more engagement with the kind of retrospective voting literature would be useful, because I feel that that's quite central to your party credibility argument, that it's about performance per se. And related to that, you have this assumption that the DA's support in Joburg and Nelson Mandela Bay is linked to the party's credibility because of its longstanding governance of Cape Town and the Western Cape. And so I think that kind of that assumption really needs to be grounded a little bit more, because if you're already showing that, only 2/3 of your respondents in Joburg even know the name of their mayor, how well do we expect respondents in these cities are following service delivery accomplishments in another city, and how they're interpreting them. So of course, the DA has gotten attention for good service delivery, but they've also been faulted for, the water shortages last year and the toilet wars a few years ago. So I think that it's a bit of a jump to assume that voters in two cities are basing their support for a party according to their performance in a different city. So I think if you can show more of the service delivery performance in these two cities that you're focusing on, I think that would make that party credibility linkage stronger. Also on the ethnic queuing, so the first question I had is, are we really talking about ethnic queuing or racial queuing? Because ethnic queuing, might consider, which you talk about a little bit in the paper, but you don't draw it out too much, but is more on the ethnic background of the mayor, Xhosa, Zulu, Sotha, et cetera, rather than just kind of black and white, which to me implies just we're looking at racial distinctions, not just ethnic. And then secondly, that the measurement you use of this is the respondents' ranking of the mayor's favorability. And so, the link between favorability assessments and ethnic queuing is a bit weak here, because we know that there's other factors from the literature that would affect perceptions of favorability, such as charisma or experience in office. So for example, the mayor in Nelson Mandela Bay obviously has a lot more experience, right? So people may have a different impression of him than our mayor in Johannesburg based on that instead of on race. So it's hard to differentiate whether that metric is actually getting at ethnic or racial queuing for me. And then, so this leads another, I guess I just maybe have 2 or 3 more minutes. I don't want to take up too much time. But it raises a separate question for me, is about whether you are looking at support for a party or for an individual. And so this, I think looking at this distinction might be more interesting and might allow you to marshal the evidence you have in a more effective way. So if you actually think about, you're not really looking at ethnic queuing, but you're looking at whether people support a party versus an individual in a way, and that directly gets to your measure. It's a much closer alignment with the measure you use. So of course, if you think the DA's electoral fortunes are dependent on its past performance, then we're of course assessing the party, which governs these cities either alone or in coalitions, as you mentioned. And in Cape Town, it's done it with many different mayors, many different leaders of the DA over time. But if we think the DA's fortunes are dependent on its mayoral personalities, then using your favorability assessment, I think, is quite valid. So while I still think you need a better measure of party credibility for your first hypothesis, I think your second hypothesis could still be tested with your existing measure, but not labeling it ethnic queuing. Just, labeling it as you have, favorability of perceptions of the mayor as an individual. Then I don't think, to me, actually, I don't think being anti-ANC and pro-opposition is really the interesting part of your paper, given all the media attention to the party, rolling blackouts, service delivery protests in the country. As you noted, it's not too shocking people are feeling anti-ANC these days. But really the interesting question to me is that in a context where voters are defecting from the ANC, why do some feel more aligned to the DA and some feel more aligned to EFF? And I think your results on the EFF are really challenge your main argument that is party credibility, because as you just noted, they don't have experience in government. So if you're trying to claim that it's party credibility from service delivery, from being, in local government, controlling local government, makes you seem increasingly credible to voters, the EFF can't claim that, but you're still seeing a lot of support for that party. So if you can be credible both with and without time in office, then the theoretical contribution of the paper is a bit diminished, because you're saying it could be a variety of reasons. But I think this could be resolved if we have, if we think a little bit more about that metric on credibility in terms of service provision, because then you could look at variability in terms of support for EFF based on its very vocal anti-corruption and populist message. But you may find for the DA, it's service provision. So you could take your metric on corruption you currently have, but if you have a more substantive metric on service provision, you could be testing whether people are reacting to different messaging to these two different opposition parties. And this would obviously require a little bit of reframing of the paper, one that looks at strategies of different opposition parties, the different strategies they use to establish their reputations in a dominant party system. So how you can do it by both being in government and also being outside of government. And then just briefly, I would rethink a little bit the use of the citizen survey, because it just seems that there were so many differences from what you're actually looking at. Of course, in terms of the level of unit of analysis, it's only looking at party leaders, it's not looking at mayors. It only allows for testing your ethnic queuing argument. And so because of all these differences, I didn't see it as a really credible way of providing a robustness test. So I think maybe questioning whether that's useful in this way, and maybe you kind of take that space to elaborate on some of these other issues. And then finally, I know you clearly recognize the scope conditions of the paper. But I think it just bears emphasizing that using governance of a city to build a reputation and potentially defeat a dominant party is, of course, a very limited option, especially for opposition's party in Africa, because you need to first have substantive political decentralization and be elected before this opportunity is even possible. But there are there are a few cases of mayors or opposition parties in Africa building their reputation this way, right? So we had the PF in Lusaka, we had the MDM in Beira in Mozambique, we had the PS in Khalifa Sall in Dakar in Senegal. So I think discussing some of these cases would give the paper a bit more broader relevance. And I think maybe more appropriate than drawing on lessons from Singapore or from Malaysia, which you do a few times in the paper. And so, especially because those are not really democratic settings, and you're trying to make this focus particularly on democratic settings. So I can share a few things that I have on that, where you can just kind of draw on some of those examples to set the context. And then there may be some other scope conditions and alternative arguments that you can't test using your data, but it might be worth just acknowledging that you recognize that limitation. And for me, I'm namely thinking about how the level of intra-party conflict within opposition parties typically affects their ability to defeat dominant parties. So opposition parties in Botswana, Namibia, and Tanzania, this has typically been one of the key problems for them in terms of their inability to gain enough votes, even to get any type of city level representation. So kind of acknowledging that there's other reasons why opposition parties may or may not be able to kind of take on dominant party regimes, and then acknowledge the limitations of your data. But I appreciated the chance to really dig more into this issue. Been following the DA for a while, but this is a really novel way of looking at their appeal in those cities.
Thank you so much. And those comments were super helpful. And I would really, I can't wait to see them written out. So it would be really useful.
Sure. Yeah, I'll email them right after to you.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. And we'll switch over to Yonatan's comments.
All right. Thank you, Naomi, for organizing. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Sounds good. And thanks for everybody for attending and organizing it. And thank you, Safia, for sharing your paper with me. I think a lot of my comments overlap with Danielle's a bit, and I've also written them up so I can share them with you when we're done as well. I enjoyed reading the paper. I think it's trying to tackle an important question in comparative politics, sort of under what conditions do opposition parties and dominant party regimes build electoral support outside of their traditional base. I think it's a good way to frame the paper. And I found that your answer that opposition parties sort of gradually build reputations as capable actors through success at local elections is interesting, and one that is under-examined too, where we tend to focus on national level elections and legislative elections. And I think the more work that looks at subnational elections in Africa, and particularly the role of councillors, municipal elections, and mayorships is very, very important and makes a good contribution. And I like the setup for the paper too, that it takes advantage of some of the subnational variation in polling data, and the finding that the ANC voters are more likely to vote for the DA when they perceive the DA as less corrupt. And I'll get into some of these issues in the conceptualization in a second, is very interesting. But of course, like I think for Danielle, it opened up a whole bunch of subsidiary questions for me that I think can be addressed in the paper. And in some ways, it's very common to have very interesting novel ideas sort of hit a stumbling block sometimes when it's the type of data that you're able to gather in the field, and you're trying to square the data that you have with the ideas that you set off at the beginning of your research program. So I think to work on this paper, there's some issues of specification, unpacking certain terms a bit more, giving the reader a bit more information about what you're thinking. And I think there's some issues in framing. At times there seems to be a bit of a gap between what you say you're going to do versus what your data actually allows you to do. And it's not necessarily a problem, it just means reframing the paper in different terms. And I don't know where this project is in your research agenda. Are you going back to the field to conduct more surveys? Because I think you can learn a lot about some issues of data from the paper as well. And if you're trying to go back to the field, maybe these are some comments that can help in if you're redesigning the survey in some way. So let me just start with some of the terminology that I agree with Danielle that this idea of credible parties, and you're trying to draw on this literature from dominant parties, hegemonic parties to build on this concept of credibility, but you might be misusing the term a bit, and it's sort of a little inconsistently used also in your measures, because you define a credible party as a party that is competent and trustworthy at delivering good governance. But my understanding of the term is a little different. And so I see credibility as some sort of indication or some expectation of regularity and institutionalization in the relationship a party has with key supporters. So it doesn't necessarily, a party can be credible but not competent to me. And a party can be credible and not that good at delivering good governance either. And I work on authoritarian politics where that's often the case. And in fact, voters might come to expect a party to engage in very corrupt behavior as long as resources are going back to specific core voters. And there's also the question that literature on credibility, it's credible to whom? And I think the literature actually doesn't talk that much about voters. It's really focused on elites. A party is credible to elites because it promises them regular promotion, repeated opportunities to contest elections, and so forth. So you have a choice here. You can use this terminology of party credibility and extend it to sort of how a party relates to voters. But I personally sort of like this idea that you're bringing about competence, perceptions of competence. And I think there's a lot of literature that you refer to here, and some of Danielle's work too as well, about opposition building in urban areas in Africa that you can draw upon, that given the difficulty of accessing resources, opposition parties, they cannot promise a flow of resources if elected. What they can promise is better governance and less corruption. And so it reframes the paper less about dominant parties and credibility and more, I think where Danielle is trying to push you as well, is that how do opposition parties make inroads in certain contexts in Africa? They don't promise policies that are substantially different, but they promise often to make those policies work better. I also echo some of the things about scope conditions a little bit, sort of specifying the population that you think your arguments really apply to, and how does South Africa really fit into the literature. I'm not an expert on South Africa. I haven't been following it as closely, but I was interested in how far your arguments travel. Is this really a story about dominant party regimes, opposition parties in general, dominant party regimes in racially divided societies like South Africa? because these are important issues because of the mechanisms that you specify. Because your theory is really, the way I understand it, is that because opposition parties are handicapped by their limited experience in government, it leads voters to distrust them and vote for the incumbent out of sort of instinct. But racial politics in South Africa also means that the DA can't draw on similar legacies as the ANC, and it can't mobilize enough core voters on its own to really forge a significant challenge. And we have other contexts as well. I would also refer to Adrian Laba's work on Zimbabwe and Zambia and opposition parties, where they've had greater success by tapping into sort of pre-existing institutional structures, using very divisive and polarizing rhetoric. So I think thinking a bit more of that, thinking more of that literature and opposition building in challenging circumstances will help you specify your argument a bit better and the scope conditions. I like the ideas that motivate the papers, that under the conditions in South Africa, parties like the DA focus on local success and then bank on those local successes to bolster their brand really as better positioned to govern than the ruling party. I think it's a very intuitive idea. It's actually one that rings true from other cases that I think about. But I think you can unpack here some of the assumptions that are baked into these arguments a bit more, especially in the setup of the paper. First, you assume that voters care about governance, and that this factor kind of supersedes racial cueing. That's part of your argument as well. And so reading that, I was just wondering if there's any data you could provide or literature to suggest that voters really do care more about governance than resource delivery. Like, how much do they care about these issues? Second, what is successful government, and what is it specifically? I think Danielle's mentioned some of the issues with water shortages and DA management as well, but what is it that you think the DA has done in office that you think matters to skeptical ANC voters? And is there evidence that you can provide regarding the type of programs they've enacted at the local level, or is it simply the fact that they've held office for longer, or is there something that they've done while they're in office that matters? And third, it's sort of a puzzle here because you're dealing with the two cases you've selected and the time period for your survey of two townships where the DA has had the mayorship, which is a pretty significant position to have the mayorship in these two major urban areas. And so it leads me to ask, what drove that local success? Because you go out of your way to explain that they've kind of made inroads into part of the ANC core territory as well. And that's very interesting, but I was left thinking, so what was their success derivative of something they did once they achieved those local positions in office, which would really bolster your theory that it's something that they did all the way back since 2000, since they opened up these local elections, and they've gradually been building out 2006, 2011 to the 2016 election. So I think that could help a bit more. I think, again, there's a bit of a gap between some of your theoretical ideas and the research setup, which might force you to kind of refocus and reframe this paper a little bit. Because again, this is a little repetitive what I just said before, that the logic is that opposition parties start small, then they move on to something bigger by building their reputations as sort of competent actors in government. But to my mind, the setup that you have here with the observational survey data that you have really only demonstrates how voters evaluate the DA for future local elections after they've already secured a mayorship. And again, if I consider a mayorship actually a pretty prestigious position, so that kind of limits some of the insights I think that you can make. It doesn't tell us how they evaluate, for instance, the DA as a national competitor, because I think also the survey question you ask is how likely you vote for the DA in the upcoming local election too, after they've already obtained that position, which is not the best test for your theory, which is that they're using these local positions to build up their reputations and move up the ladder, eventually gaining more and more prestige and territory. So like in an ideal world, you'd be asking these questions back in 2011 before they held the mayorship in Johannesburg, for instance, and testing, whether that led to them to vote for somebody for the mayorship in Johannesburg more likely based on their perception of the DA. There's some definitional issues in the survey terminology. The question of partisanship, this concept, the way you ask it is, what party do you feel closest to? And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's measured dichotomously as a binary from 0 to 1.
No,
maybe I'm wrong, but that
open-ended.
It's open-ended.
Yeah.
But you just voted. When I think partisanship, I think dedicated people who have worked for the party from a young age, who are committed to the party. And the way I understood your measure is just basically people who feel connected somehow to the ANC versus the DA. So they have to choose one party, but it's not really a measure of the intensity of their partisanship.
Actually, it's a two-part question. Sorry to interrupt. It's
Okay.
open-ended, and then on a 5-point scale.
They do a 5-point scale.
Intense? Yeah.
Okay, because that's not in the results, because the way you present the results is not clear what an ANC partisan is from the discussion then. So I'd like to see that broken down. If you have that Likert scale that measures some of the intensity of partisanship, that would be very interesting.
Got it.
Similarly, you have this idea of voting preference too, and it's presented as a binary. Who do you vote for versus how the intensity of that preference, especially in survey data. I think that's very important because you don't have the actual voting behavior, but some measure of the intensity of preference. And the same thing for your independent variable, credibility or competence, whatever you want to measure. It's presented as what party do you think has a greater capacity to provide better governance, rather than scaling this a bit more. So I think if you have the ability to break that down a bit more, you'll get, I think, a lot more nuance and a lot more confidence actually in the results. And I think some of these issues come up like on page 22, 23 when you begin to discuss endogeneity, because the fact that 45% of DA partisans also view the ANC or the EFF as a party with better reputations was very surprising to me. So that could mean, you interpret that as saying that partisanship doesn't really tinge people's perceptions of competence. But it could also mean that your measure of competence is off a little bit too. When people are forced to make a binary choice, they make that you get results like this. So I think if you break that down a bit more, that would be very, very interesting. I have a whole thing about ethnic queuing, but I think Danielle's covered this. I also have issues, again, with is it ethnic queuing or racial queuing? And I wasn't quite clear how are you using that result, that Likert scale that you actually use for racial queuing in the models that you were presenting later. And I actually agree with Danielle. I thought this was just a better measure of local popularity rather than racial or ethnic queuing, which could be interesting in its own right. In the results, I was wondering too if just reading these models, because they're very straightforward models if you run any sort of interaction with age and income to see if this has an impact on both the perception of parties, but also on voter choice. Is this a generational thing within the ANC that's happening? The younger voters are feeling more disillusioned from the ANC. And I think that like the big issue, which has kind of been hinted at, is that observational data like this, there's always going to be questions of endogeneity. Mm-hmm. And I think this can be built out and addressed. I don't think you can ever address this perfectly with this kind of data, but it can be built out a bit more in the narrative. And again, in the setup and some of the alternative theories that you bring in as well, like just addressing them and making sure they're given some comment here. Because there seem to be factors that explain both the rise of the DA's sort of party credibility, mm-hmm. and the vote share that it receives that are not addressed here. And it really comes out because on page 11, you note that voting patterns indicate that support for the ANC has slowly declined over time. And that to me was a big clue that there are obviously a lot of other factors influencing DA support. And it also gets to your independent variable because perceptions of competence at governance are relational. Right? They relate to your perception of the party in power as well. And so it's an endogenous issue that's very difficult to unpack. I'm a qualitative scholar, so I think anytime you get into like real stories, it helps to unpack that a bit more. But that the decline of the ANC, the corruption scandal, its own failings, is it more of that versus how competent the DA has actually been at governance, or the gap between the two that's grown? And the perception of that gap that has grown, rather than that the DA has actually done that good of a job, administering these two townships and these loose coalitions that they've had for the past few years. So that to me is a big issue that I think also if you unpack the data, like I said, a little bit more, that underlying issue that you'll probably get if you submit this for publication, you'll get a lot of comments about that endogeneity, or that everybody hates, but it's in all research and we have to sort of deal with it somehow. So those are my comments. Hope I didn't take too much time, but thank you. I really enjoyed reading the paper.
Jonathan, thanks so much for your comments. So, Safia, would you like to take a few minutes to respond to some of the points before we open it up to everybody?
Yes. First of all, I felt that both Danielle and Yonatan's comments were very useful. There's a lot that I feel like I can definitely do in terms of reframing the paper, and just getting to some of Danielle's points. I agree that there are some like conceptual issues with the measures, and I don't have too much wiggle room right now in terms of being able to redo those, but just using them in a way that sort of addresses the nuance and maybe reframes it in terms of how is it that how do I explain this gap between whether it's declining support for the ANC versus like just the DA's performance. And so just based on the comments that I received today, I think I have some ideas in terms of how to reframe it and the type of literature that I could tap more into based on like opposition building in difficult contexts such as Zimbabwe and whatnot. So I generally found both of these like reactions to be very useful. I'll probably have a lot more in terms of concrete questions to ask as we have more conversation, but overall, really useful.
Great. Shelby, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, a couple of comments. So I think first, building off the discussant's comments, I found it a little bit of a kind of leap to use this concept of credibility as with a measure of corruption. And I thought it also just made the argument more confusing because when I was thinking about the concept of credibility, I couldn't wrap my head around how ethnicity or race or whatever would be shaping attitudes about leaders, if not through the credibility mechanism. So I thought it actually might have been more clear if you just stuck with the concept of corruption. And I think the other challenge with using the concept of credibility was it was just hard to build out like why this was surprising. Like why would it be the case that there isn't a relationship between credibility and being more likely to vote for the DA? And then second, I found some of your hypotheses a little hard to wrap my head around in terms of like what they meant in general terms. So I thought it might be useful to kind of restate some of your hypotheses in general terms as opposed to using words like ANC and the DA. And also with regard to the hypotheses, sometimes because it was sometimes hard to figure out what the counterfactual was. So if it's like ANC partisans living in a city run by a black DA mayor and to view the mayor favorably are more likely to vote for the party in the future, it was like compared to what, like which of those variables is going to be changing in the counterfactual. And then just two other kind of super quick comments. First, I thought it would have been useful to clarify how your survey was better than Afrobarometer. I don't really know anything about what questions are asked for South Africa in the Afrobarometer, but just saying like the Afrobarometer doesn't ask questions about attitudes toward XYZ. I think that would have been useful. And then last, I didn't totally understand the case selection argument. So like why you needed to pick areas that were the DA base, because surely there are ANC partisans who you could test the argument out with in any city. So just kind of clarifying the case selection, I think might have been useful, but I really enjoyed the paper.
Wonderful, and thank you for raising these points. I definitely will clarify why the survey is different from Afrobarometer. And one point in particular, Afrobarometer doesn't ask for local election vote intentions. Or at least not all of the waves. So that's definitely something I can include in the paper. For your last question, I also will clarify or add more details to why I selected these two cases. My thinking was that I should focus on cities where people at least have some familiarity with DA governance, that they are exposed to that. That's really my main motivation. I think I should unpack that some more in the paper. But yeah, I could have definitely done it nationwide. I was just concerned that, for instance, if you get someone from KwaZulu-Natal, where the DA hasn't been in government there, at least not at the mayoral level, that might be kind of, it might be good comparison with people who do live in places under DA leadership. But yeah, maybe that's another way that I'll expand on the project and just maybe kind of use different cities and whatnot. So that's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just
Oh,
was
please go ahead.
curious about, since you just mentioned it, can you tell us a little bit more about where you are in the project? Like, do you have the opportunity to do more data collection?
Definitely, I do. Not right now, but in the future I will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the survey ended in August. I collected it. It was in the field for just 2 weeks. And the thing about mobile phone surveys is that it's much more easier to do
Right, right.
versus just the on the ground surveys. So I definitely do intend to expand on this project.
Yeah, because I mean, I do think Shelby's point is a key one because it would let you get to that. Is it really anti-ANC corruption versus DA governance that makes the difference, right? So, even targeting, yeah, cities like Durban, for example, that haven't had that DA presence, but you may find, there's still an inclination to, find some type of support for the DA because of the corruption linkage. So it would kind of give you a little bit more analytical leverage about these hypotheses if you are able to roll out another geopoll.
And I
You'd have
guess just
to, you'd have the timing issue where they're being done at different times. So that would be a comparability issue, but yeah, I think it would add some analytical leverage.
Definitely.
And just to add on that, maybe even if Afrobarometer doesn't ask like who you intend, would you ever vote for the DA? Maybe they have some other question about like just attitudes toward the DA that even if you can't do other data collection, you could kind of use that to test some of the stuff Danielle was just saying.
Great suggestion. That's something I can do like in the immediate future.
So I've got two comments. So one of these is, I can't remember who raised this, but given that the DA is in office, like really the retrospective voting literature, it seems to be a really natural fit.
Mm-hmm.
And in thinking about how did parties get grow from local to national, the argument that's been made for Turkey was, that this Islamist party had this anti-corruption message. They took over Istanbul, and everybody saw that was run well, and then that other people in other places saw it and grew their reputation. And you cite Ethan China's work, but part of his argument has been, well, keeping opposition parties out of local government, prevents them from showing the competence. And so this, it seems to be that it's really, quite important that people have seen, a mayor from a particular party in office and seen how they do it. And so I think the larger context probably has to engage the retrospective voting literature more concretely. And kind of for future work, a lot of the measures were, which party do you find are you closest to? Which party is most this or that? And I think, for something like credibility, it could be that you find lots of parties not credible, but this one is of the terrible ones the best, or lots of parties very credible, and one is just slightly more than all the other ones. And so you're framing the way the questions are asked, already asking for a choice as opposed to a level assessment of the different parties. And so, so you might imagine that, that's already kind of driving a particular result of a connection between those answers. And it could be that somebody who feels all the parties are quite credible, but you happen to particularly like one, is actually somebody who could be easily switched from one party or another. But somebody who also gave the same answer as same party as the answer, but felt the other two were really not at all credible, is not at all movable. And similarly, if you had somebody who said this party is particularly credible, but actually felt all the parties were not very credible, then that person might be in danger of becoming a non-voter. And I think thinking about, well, how do people switch from going from one, identifying with one party to others? You probably want to set up the questions to be able to capture these kinds of differences instead of just asking which one is most this or you're closest to. So in those ways, I think kind of future work and kind of build on what you have so far.
Great suggestion. And that would definitely bring more nuance to the analysis as well. And I totally agree that the way that the measure is set up currently might lead people to just make sort of this dichotomous choice, as Jonathan was referring to earlier. And in future reiterations, I think I definitely will sort of ask them to, in terms of levels, okay, in terms of levels of assessment, which party compared to the other has a better reputation or like a perception of the parties. I agree with that. There's a couple of other questions I have, but anyone else can also jump in if they want.
I think Alex
And
is
if I
waving.
jump in, I've got a dash at exactly 4. But this was really interesting. I'm actually really jealous of the feedback that you've got. This is like, at some point, somewhere down the line, I really want to do this and get this kind of like detailed level of kind of critique and sort of steps forward. So I just had I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just sort of throw one in there. I was wondering kind of where ideology fits into this sort of discussion, because I feel like the determinants of sort of voters switching here are both kind of what the literature would almost deem as like ideological determinants, right? It's good governance. It's almost like valence issues about whether you think a party is going to be better at fighting corruption or not, or whether it's sort of an ethnic voting type of argument. And I was wondering, because in my mind, South Africa is very much like, I feel like there's a lot more ideology in African politics than a lot of studies would have, but South Africa is definitely one of the sort of clear places, right? The DA, more right-wing, EFF, more left-wing, ANC, somewhere sort of nefariously in the middle. And I was wondering kind of whether there's also a story of kind of like partisan sorting or ideological realignment that might be happening here, where people are, they've been voting ANC since 1994 because it's the party to vote for, and then kind of come 20 years in are thinking, actually, you know what, I am a little bit more conservative. I am going to vote a little bit more with the DA, or I do feel like there needs to be more redistribution. I'll vote with the EFF. So I was kind of wondering whether you have measures that might be able to capture kind of like ideological position or preference around social policy that could kind of get at that.
Great question. I don't have a scale that measures ideology in this survey. However, I did ask people what wealth category they fall into. Not that I'm saying that wealth and ideology are like necessarily tightly linked in South Africa, but there is this sort of literature on the rise of the middle class and the fact that middle class voters are much less stable for the ANC. And so one thing I could do very quickly is perhaps break the data down along class. That's one way maybe to look at it. But I think Afrobarometer has questions on ideology. I'm not 100% certain, but I could definitely look into that to see in terms of what type of ideologues end up supporting the DA, like who in the past have voted for the ANC. And I think that's a really great point that you make, and it's something that it's a argument that I generally have to contend with in the dissertation in general, because as you said, ideology is kind of not very much like the role of ideology is kind of under examined in African politics literature. So yeah, I agree that this is something that I can add to this chapter or in the dissertation at large.
Okay, on that note, I might actually run, but thank you very much. It was good meeting everyone.
Thank you.
We'll probably have time for one final question.
I was just wondering if you could clarify like what your thinking was behind using this concept of credibility with the corruption measure. Like, was there something about using the concept of corruption that you felt like didn't really capture what you were trying to get at?
Yeah, a great question. So I actually didn't include this in the paper, but there was a question from Afrobarometer that looked at different domains, like, for example, the economy, corruption, I think it was like healthcare, education, and it asked people to compare which party is better at handling this issue, the ruling party or the opposition. It didn't specifically say the DA, but it said the opposition. And so when I looked into that variable, I found that the category in which people were most likely to say that the opposition did better was corruption. And so that's kind of what motivated my deciding to use this issue. I'm sorry, this factor. And I don't know if that answers your question.
So maybe I didn't read the paper super carefully, but so the variable, the credibility variable, is just a measure of corruption. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so yeah, so what you just said makes a lot of sense. I would say then just like use the word corruption and maybe like reframe it a little bit around corruption with the motivation you just mentioned. Like I don't think it adds that much to use the word credibility instead of corruption. But it's just my
definitely no, that's a great suggestion, and I actually will do that for sure.
Okay, so we're at time, so we'll wrap up, but thank you so much, Safia, for sharing a super interesting paper with us, and thank you very much to our two discussants who did super careful reading and hopefully had comments that were really useful for Safia. So,
absolutely. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, everyone. This is great.
Thank you. Hope to see you at a future one.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.